Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another social emotional workshop. We are here with Care of Southeastern Michigan, and they are going to be talking about the effects of alcohol and your health. Kayla, Brooke, welcome back. We're so glad to have you. A little housekeeping before we start. I have put a link in the chat for everyone to click on and complete the survey after the workshop. We'd greatly appreciate it if you would click on that link and fill out the few questions that they're asking and submit them. And if there is anyone in the audience that are looking to obtain sketch credits, please put your name and department and PIC number in the chat, and I will make sure that you receive any sketch credits. So with all that being said, again, Kayla, Brooke, we're so glad to have you back. You can go ahead and get started.
So just kind of to get to know the audience, do we have mainly all school staff and parents or any
No,
students?
I see some students, Kayla.
Okay. So, the link that's in the chat is actually the one from last week. So let me put in the one for this week's presentation. So I'm going to send that right now to you guys. Sure, I have the right screen shared. All right, so I just want to make sure that you guys are seeing the presentation up on the screen.
No, we are not.
What about now?
Yes.
Okay, all righty. So again, my name is Kayla Datzel, and I'm the Director of Substance Use Prevention at Care of Southeastern Michigan, and Brooke Wakeford is a preventionist here at Care of Southeastern Michigan. So Care of Southeastern Michigan has been around since 1977. In 2019, we opened our Recovery United Community Center, and this is an accredited program in which our peer recovery coaches provide a variety of different services throughout the community. CARE's mission is to strengthen resiliency in people and their communities through prevention, education, and services that improve the quality of their life. So what that means is that we work with individuals and communities to ensure that they are healthy, safe, and have the resources and skills to live with resilience. And we do this through a variety of our different services. So we have youth and adult clinical and treatment services. We also then have case management services. In regards to our recovery support, so we have peer coaches that are in the hospitals as well as in the community. And then we also then have a family coach and then a teen peer coach, in which the teen and family coach actually works together. So typically what we see is that a teenager who is looking for recovery support, they will get a coach, and then their family members will get a coach, and they'll get individual and family counseling as well. And then what Brooke and I do is in the substance use prevention side of things. So going into the community and providing different education in regards to substance use. And then we also have parenting classes as well. So after today, you're going to be able to identify health risks with using alcohol, dispel myths about using alcohol, as well as identify consequences with using alcohol. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask you to put in the chat, or you can come off mute to answer, what is a drug?
Could it be anything that makes us feel better, happy?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is, by definition, it's any chemical substance except for food that causes mental, emotional, or behavioral changes in the user. So really what that means is that it's anything except for food that we put into our bodies that changes the way we think, feel, or act. So what we're going to do next is just a little fact or myth. So you can go ahead and type your answers in the chat for this. So fact or myth, alcohol is a stimulant.
So far we got fact. A bunch of facts.
So that is actually a myth. So alcohol, what we call, is called America's drug of choice because this is the most commonly abused mind-altering drug. What it does is that it actually assaults all parts of the brain. So all parts of the brain are actually impacted when someone consumes alcohol. And alcohol is a depressant. So what that means is that it actually slows things down, and your inhibitions are lowered due to alcohol's depressing effect. And so what happens is that it actually depresses the brain centers for judgment and self-control. Sometimes we do have people that will say, well, when I drink alcohol, I get more energy, things like that. Your brain's actually being tricked to believe that, but everything is actually slowing down itself. So fact or myth, alcohol can impact your senses.
All right, we got a bunch of facts again.
So that is a fact. So what happens is that your cerebral cortex, which is responsible for that sense, getting your senses connected, it's actually slowed down when someone drinks. So what we see is that an individual's vision could get blurry, so it might be even harder for them to see as well. Or they may start to slur their words. They could also have a decreased hearing, so not being able to hear as well. Or they could have trouble touching things, or being able to hold things, but then also trouble with smelling and tasting. And this can actually happen after one drink. So it not necessarily something that we might see after a long periods of time. However, this is typically, especially with the smelling and tasting, that's usually over a long period of time that sense is impacted. So fact or myth, drinking can impact your self-control, ability to plan, think, and make decisions.
We got a couple people saying facts so far. Fact.
Guys are correct. That is a fact. So what happens is that our frontal lobes, which is that front part of our brain, that's responsible for our self-control, our planning, our forming ideas, and decision making. What I like to say is that our frontal lobes is kind of, if we were to think of our brain as a car, this would be that brake center. So this really causes us to stop and think. And what we see is that over a long period of time, alcohol use can actually damage the frontal lobes forever. So what we see is that with the brain, when damage occurs, it's not something that can be reversed with some of our other organs. So fact or myth, alcohol does not affect memory.
We're getting myth on this one.
So that is a myth. So our hippocampus is the part of the brain that helps with memory. So what we see is that when someone drinks alcohol, that they may have trouble remembering something that they just learned, or could have difficulty remembering things from a while ago. And this can happen after just 1 or 2 drinks. What we also see is that an individual could experience a blackout, which is not being able to remember entire events, such as what you did last night, from drinking a lot of alcohol very quickly within a short amount of time. So fact or myth, the amount of liquid in your glass, can, or bottle is the same as the amount of alcohol in your drink.
So we have a couple myths. We have one that's not sure.
Okay. So that is a myth. So what we know is that there's standard drink sizes. So different types of beer, wine, or malt liquor can have very different amounts of alcohol content. So typically what happens is that a 12-ounce beer typically has about 5% of alcohol. An 8 to 9 ounce glass of malt liquor typically has about 7% of alcohol. 5 ounces of table wine usually has about 12% of alcohol, and a 1.5 shot of 80 proof spirits, which is typically like whiskey, gin, rum, vodka, and tequila, typically have about 40% of alcohol. And all of these, even though there's different ounces of liquid in there, are all relatively considered the same standard drink size. And so, although standard drink amounts are helpful for following health guidelines, they may not reflect customary serving sizes. So, for example, a single mixed drink made with 80 proof spirits can contain anywhere from 1 to 3 or even more standard drinks, depending on the type of spirits and the recipe. So, fact or myth, binge drinking doesn't occur when you're in high school or college because you are supposed to drink.
All myths so far. Big myth.
That is a big myth. So, binge drinking can occur in college, and what we consider binge drinking is excessive drinking. So, for women, for example, binge drinking is consuming 4 or more drinks on one occasion. And then for men, it's actually 5 or more drinks consumed on one occasion. We then consider heavy drinking for women, 8 or more drinks per week, and for men, 15 or more drinks per week. We also consider excessive alcohol use when any alcohol is consumed by someone who is pregnant. And that's because what can happen is that when an individual consumes alcohol when they are pregnant, they are putting their child at risk for developing what we call a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And we call it FASDs for short, are 100% preventable because the only cause for FASDs is consuming alcohol while pregnant. And then excessive alcohol use is also if anyone under the age of 21 is consuming alcohol. So fact or myth, if you only have 1 drink, you're fine to drive.
We have a lot of myths.
That is correct. That is a myth. So, and that's because of our blood alcohol content. So it doesn't matter what type of alcohol you can choose to consume. A drink is a drink, and your blood alcohol content is actually what determines how drunk you are. So again, someone might consume 1 standard size drink, and that's going to seriously impact their ability to drive and make sure that they're, of course, following any type of signs, especially if their vision starts to get blurry. Fact or myth, I have to have a blood alcohol content of 0.08 or above to face legal charges.
We have a couple myths. Someone's not sure.
So that is a myth. So the reason why that's a myth is because there's something that is called operating while visibly impaired. And that means that it's obvious to the officer that you were unable to operate a vehicle. And there's actually no minimum blood alcohol level to qualify for this charge. So really what this is saying is that a police officer is saying, you had something to drink, and I can tell that you weren't able to operate your vehicle. And then we also have then the operating while impaired. So this is a situation where the influence of drugs or alcohol has seriously impacted an individual's ability to operate a vehicle. So what we see is that for the first offense, for either one of those, is that an individual is facing up to 93 days in jail and 360 hours of community service. However, for the operating while visibly impaired, in addition to the two listed above, they're also facing a $300 fine, 90 days of driving restrictions, so that could be the hours or destination of travel. They're facing 4 points on their driver's license and or a $500 driver responsibility fine. For operating while intoxicated, an individual faces anywhere from $100 to $500 fine, 180 days suspended license, 6 points on their driver's license, and or a $1,000 driver responsibility fine. Now, let's say that someone has a second offense within 7 years. For either one, they could face a fines of $200 to $1,000, 5 days to 1 year in prison, having their driver's license revoked for 1 year, or possible vehicle seizure. And if the vehicle's not taken, they could potentially lose the ability to use it for anywhere from 90 to 180 days, as well as then facing 30 to 90 days of community service. With the operating while visibly impaired, the individual will then get 4 points on their driving record and potentially have to pay a $500 annual driver's responsibility fee for 2 years. So that's actually a total of $1,000 within those 2 years. And for the operating while intoxicated, they then are faced with 6 points on their driving record and $1,000 annual driver's responsibility fee for 2 years, so $2,000 over those 2 years. And then let's say the person has a third offense within 10 years. That's actually then considered a felony charge under Michigan drunk driving laws. And with either one of those, an individual is facing up to $500 to $5,000 in fines, 1 to 5 years in prison, 60 to 180 days community service, and then possibly having their vehicle taken. If it's not taken, they could lose the ability to use it for 1 to 3 years. Operating while visibly impaired, 4 points on their driver's license, and again, $500 annual driver responsibility fee for 2 years. Operating while intoxicated, 6 points on their driver's license, and or a $1,000 annual driver's responsibility fee for 2 years. And in addition to all that, that's not including then the cost of court, legal fees, if you then are assigned to having to take a class or anything of that nature. So fact or myth, drinking isn't all that dangerous.
We're getting myth in the chat.
That is a myth. So our brain, we know it's pretty important. And when it's fully developed, it roughly weighs about 3 pounds. And we know that it's not fully developed until the mid-20s. And for some individuals, it's not actually fully developed until the late 20s, early 30s. And like we talked about, so when alcohol is consumed, it's then slowing down the thinking process and reaction time. And then our liver is another very important organ for our body, and that's because it protects our blood from infection, diseases, poison, and viruses. So when we're referring to alcohol, this is actually considered a poison in regards to our liver. And it actually takes our liver about 1 hour to fully get rid of one standard size drink. And so if someone is consuming more than one standard size drink in that hour, the liver then is what we call getting overloaded. And so this is again when typically someone is consuming more than one standard size drink in a sitting. And so what we know that legally in the state of Michigan, someone's blood alcohol content, if they're 21 years or older, it should be a 0.08 or less. And then for anyone 21 years old, it's a 0 tolerance. So there are a variety of different consequences for excessive and underage drinking. So what we see in regards to health problems is that when someone is consuming alcohol, they're more likely to have suicide attempts. And then they're actually 6 times more likely to have an alcohol use or dependence if they start consuming alcohol before the age of 15. There's also an increased risk of police involvement, and that's due to drunk driving, or again, because not thinking clearly, you might vandalize, or you might have property damage occurring as well. There's then also academic problems. So whether it be forgetting to submit assignments or not remembering what you had just learned, and so then you're failing your exam. And then also one of the possibilities is death. When someone consumes too much alcohol in a time frame, they could have alcohol poisoning, which can lead to death if left untreated. And then of course, injury. So when you're not able to fully process everything, even hold things or walk straight, you're more likely at risk to have an injury. And then also violence. So what we know is that assault and sexual abuse do occur when there is an increase of drinking. And then we also know that it's possible that unsafe sex occurs, which then leads to pregnancy and STIs. So what we've seen is that 44% of people diagnosed with an STI admit to excessive drinking prior to having sex. So fact or myth, you are only at risk of a drinking problem if you are involved in Greek life when you're in college.
We are getting myth.
You guys are correct. That is a myth. So what we've seen is that there are a variety of different factors that can affect someone's drinking when they're away at college. So what we've seen is that an individual is at lower risk if they're attending a 2-year institution. And that's really due to the fact that the individual is more likely living at home with their parents, so less likely to consume alcohol, as well as if they're attending a religious school. And this is typically because of the fact that those religious schools do tend to have in their code of conduct something in regards to alcohol use, especially on their campus, as well as commuter schools. So again, because there's not that on-campus presence, it's less likely that someone is going to consume large amounts of alcohol. And then also typically too, what we see is that historically Black colleges and universities have a lower risk, and that's again due to the policies that we see in place for those colleges and universities. And then what we see as higher risk is for first-year students. So this is typically due to the fact that this is that first time that they're away from their parents and really having to, as I would like to say, be an adult. And so that kind of gives them some different challenges within itself. And so then they're more likely to consume alcohol because of that being that first time away from home experience. What we also see is that males are at actually higher risk of drinking than females, and that's really due to the societal pressures in which we say that it's more acceptable for men to drink, especially drinking large quantities at once compared to females. And then individuals who identify as white, and again, that kind of relates back to that historically Black college and university. And then Greek life. So again, this is due to the societal acceptance of consuming alcohol while in Greek life. So those fraternities and sororities, especially because these are the ones that are known for having the parties in which alcohol is involved. As well as we know is that hazing is a thing that does occur in fraternities and sororities. And most of the time the hazing does revolve around alcohol use as well. And then athletes. So what we see is that athletes are at higher risk due to there typically being a celebration of some sort following a game, which then leads to the likelihood that they are going to consume alcohol. And next, what we're going to touch on is addiction. So how many believe that addiction is a disease?
We have a couple of yeses in the chat.
And yes, so addiction is a disease. What we know is that it is a brain-based disease, and it actually starts as a choice and then spirals. And it's also not a character flaw. It is also chronic. And that's because drug addiction is typically characterized by drug seeking and use that is compulsive or difficult to control despite harmful consequences. And it's also progressive. So that is because of the brain changing that occurs over time with drug use, and it challenges someone who's addicted with their self-control and interferes with their ability to resist intense urges to take drugs. This is why drug addiction is also a relapsing disease. And what we know is that relapse is the return to the drug use after an attempt to stop. And relapse does typically indicate the need for more or different types of treatment. Over time, the brain adjusts to the excess dopamine, which reduces the high that persons who are using feel compared to the high that they felt when first taking the drug. And that's what we also call tolerance. And they might be needing to take more of the drug in order to achieve the same dopamine high. We also know that it's fatal. So most drugs affect the brain's reward circuit by flooding it with the chemical messenger dopamine, and this overstimulation of the reward circuit causes the intensely pleasurable high that leads people to take a drug again and again. And addiction can be fatal if it is left untreated. We also know that addiction is genetic. So while no single factor can predict whether a person will become addicted to drugs, a combinations of genetics, environmental, and developmental factors influences risk for addiction. The more risk factors a person has, the greater chance that taking drugs can lead to addiction. However, there is some good news with addiction. We know that it's treatable and it can be successfully managed. And even more good news is that it is preventable. And so that's why we know it's really good to have those role models in our lives that can help talk to us and that we can go to that are safe and trusted adults. So what we see is that there's usually a stage that occurs with addiction. So typically there's this experimental, we call it the learning stage. And this is when someone's curious about how the drug will affect them, and they might turn to drugs as a way to temporarily forget or to cope with problems in a single moment. When the person uses, they do not necessarily experience any serious negative social or legal consequences at this stage. And then we see the misuse of substance. So this is the seeking stage. So this is when an individual, they continue to look forward to using the substance after learning what the effects do to their body. And then they may start to have some negative consequences, but they continue to use. And what we see is that during this stage, regular misuse is typically a telltale sign that addiction should be in that individual's future. And then what we see is the loss of choice. And this is really when the abuse of substances is occurring, and that's because of the chemical change that occurs within someone's body. And they start to actually crave the drug. And so they're constantly looking for ways to use, and they keep using despite any negative consequences. So despite maybe getting and operating while visibly impaired, or having a broken relationship, maybe with their family or their friends, or getting in trouble at home or in school. And then the final stage is addiction and dependency. So during this stage, what we see is that there's a compulsion to use substances despite any and all consequences to the individual's relationship with their family, whether as well as then physical and mental health, even personal finances or job security. And they can't function without consuming the substance. And what we know is that addictions can be physical, psychological, and emotional, or even a combination of all three. So what we like to do is, if you are currently drinking, to talk about some ways to actually cut down on the alcohol use. So one thing that we recommend is keeping track. So we want you to keep track of how much you drink and finding a way that actually works for you. So some people, what we've heard is that they'll use an index card and put it in their wallet or their purse, and they'll make check marks of how much they consumed, or they'll even put check marks on a kitchen calendar, or even in their phone, they'll write down when they drink. And if you make note of each drink before you drink it, this will help you slow down when needed. We also suggest counting and measuring. So know the standard drink size so you can count your drinks accurately. One standard drink, again, is 12 ounces of regular beer, 8 to 9 ounces of malt liquor, 5 ounces of table wine, or 1.5 ounces of 80 proof spirits. And we recommend that you measure your drinks at home and away from home, especially with mixed drinks. We know that it can be hard to keep track, and at times you may be getting more alcohol than you think. With wine, you may even need to ask, if let's say you're at a party or even at a restaurant, that you ask that server or the person that's hosting the party not to top off a partially filled glass. We also recommend setting goals. So decide how many days a week you want to drink and how many drinks you'll have on those days. It is a good idea to have some days when you don't drink, because drinking within the limits within those guidelines reduces the chances of having an alcohol use disorder and related health problems. We also recommend pacing and spacing. So what that means is that when you do drink, you pace yourself. So you might sip the drink slowly, or you have no more than one drink within per hour, and then adding spacers to it, which would be like non-alcoholic drinks such as water, soda, or juice. And so what we see typically is with the spacer is that someone will have one drink of alcohol, and then they'll wait an hour, and then they'll have a non-alcoholic drink, and then continue that, or they'll just stop after that non-alcoholic drink. We also recommend knowing and avoiding anything that might trigger you to drink. So for example, if certain people or places make you drink, even when you don't want to, you want to try to avoid them. If certain activities or even the time of day or even feelings trigger the urge, plan what you'll do instead of drinking. If drinking at home is a problem, you should then keep little or no alcohol there. We also recommend to plan how you're going to handle your urges. So when an urge hits, consider these options. Remind yourself of your reasons for changing, or talk it through with someone you trust, or even get involved with a healthy, distracting activity. Or we always recommend to urge surf. So instead of fighting the feeling, accept it and ride it out, knowing that it will soon cross just like a wave and pass. Also knowing your no. So you're likely to be offered a drink at times when you don't want one, and you can always have a polite, convincing no thanks ready. And the faster you can say no to these offers, the less likely you are to give in. If you hesitate, it allows time for you to think of excuses to go along with drinking. And so there are some important things that we want you to remember. That someone who uses drugs, including alcohol, risks hurting themselves emotionally and physically. Alcohol use can have a significant effect on your health, family relationships, friendships, and the ability to perform well in school and sports. It's important to find ways to manage feelings and to deal with stress and have fun without using marijuana, alcohol, and other drugs. And most teens actually do not drink alcohol or use other drugs. Also, too, if you ever did need help, you can always contact Care of Southeastern Michigan at 586-541-2273 or our Recovery United Community Center at 586-552-1120. And we can absolutely put you in contact with getting either a peer coach or some different helps out there as well. Any questions for us today?
You guys feel free to unmute and ask your questions, or if you prefer, you can type them and I'll be more than happy to read. Good deal. All right. Well, if we don't have any questions or comments, again, go into the chat and click on the link and make sure you fill out the survey. And we will see you next time. And everybody have a great day and have a great weekend. Thank you, Kayla, and thank you, Brooke. We'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye.